Okay, right. So we have now begun in earnest. A very warm welcome to you all, a very large crowd, which speaks volumes to great interest in why we're all here, which is, of course, to celebrate the publication of Clare Summerskill's new book, Creating Verbatim Theatre from Oral Histories, published this year by Routledge. My name's George Severs. I'm an oral historian of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Britain. I'm one of the public history editors of the journal Oral History, and very proud to be the secretary of the LGBTQ special interest group of the Oral History Society. We are thrilled that this event is able to be co-hosted by our SIG, the LGBTQ SIG, and a newly created SIG, the Creatives SIG. And we'll be hearing a little bit more about that in just a few moments. Let me first just explain how this event's going to work. We're very keen this event be fun and informal, and so this is the only formal part of the evening. So let me first of all, I'm going to very quickly, before I forget, show you all a flyer that Claire has very kindly procured from Routledge, which has not only some information, but crucially at the bottom has a code, FLR40, which will enable you to get 20% off Creating Verbatim Theatre from Oral Histories if you buy this book from Routledge. So of course the book is available from all decent and immoral booksellers. Take your pick. If you're watching this on YouTube later, you can pause, or as I say, I'll put the code, which is just here, in the chat once I've finished talking. So how the event is going to work from here on in is that I will in a second just explain who our special interest group, or SIG, is. I'm then going to hand over to Pam Schweitzer, who's going to introduce the creatives, the creative SIG. And at that point, we will hand over to Jane Traies for the reason we're all here, which is her conversation with Dr. Clare Summerskill. So I'll just very, very briefly say that the LGBTQ special interest group has been around for a good couple of years now, maybe as many as 4 or 5. And it is a group that brings together people who are working on LGBTQ oral histories. Perhaps they are LGBTQ oral historians themselves working in other areas, or perhaps straight allies working in both or neither fields. But you may be familiar with our work if you saw the special issue of the Oral History Journal that we published, I think, last year, which is just here. If I lean, you can maybe see it. But that's the second most recent journal. So you can go and look that up. We host events about 3 or 4 times a year, usually in London, but we've tried to spread those around the rest of the country. And of course, now we're all connected via Zoom. We can do this more regularly and with greater connectivity, which again is why it's so wonderful to see so many of you here. With that, I think the only other thing I had to say before I hand over is that we're, as I say, very keen this be a celebratory and fun event, and people are very free and should be encouraged if they are so inclined to toast Claire's book, and I'm happy to lead by example with this glass of beer. So without further ado, let me hand over to Pam Schweitzer. We're very happy to have her here, and she will explain to us who the creatives are and how you can get more involved with them. So Pam, over to you. If you want to unmute yourself, you'll be audible and visible to everybody.
Oh, hello everybody. Thank you, George, and delighted to be here tonight. And Claire's a huge friend, and we've worked together over many years. So personally, I'm delighted and full of congratulations, even without knowing much about it yet, of what she's just done. I'm looking forward to hearing about it. Yes, this is joint hosted with probably the newest SIG. Certainly it's only a baby SIG, creative oral history, needs a lot of nurturing and supporting. So it's great to be being put in touch with lots of people who I'm quite sure will share a lot of the aims and objectives of the creative oral history SIG. I think essentially it's a special interest group for people who enjoy working with oral history, but particularly have an interest in developing out of that pursuit creative outcomes, whether it's theatre, poetry, music, inspired by what's been collected in the oral histories. So we've only started meeting very recently with quite a lot of show and tell sessions where we can learn about each other's work. There's another representative here who I haven't spotted yet, but William Burns, who I think is going to tell you about, oh, there's William, I've spotted you, about a couple of upcoming events that the Creative Oral History SIG is going to launch very soon.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks, Pam. I've just been asked to speak about a couple of things really quickly, which is the mapping project that the Creative Oral History SIG are involved in developing at the moment. We're aiming to produce an online interactive map that will pinpoint creative oral history projects around the United Kingdom. We already have a few projects listed on there with some descriptions of what they entail, and just inviting people who are attending today, if you are involved in any creative oral history projects and you would like to be included in our online map, then please get in touch with us. I'm going to type in contact details into the chat here in a second, and that way you can get in touch with us. And the second thing is that we're going to be having a Christmas gathering, the Creative Oral Historians, and that's going to be taking place on Thursday, the 3rd of December. We're going to be having a members show and tell. So there will be some people presenting in 10-minute slots about their creative oral history project. You'll get to see some of the creative oral history work that's going on around the country. And we're also going to be joined by Mary Stewart, who's going to be speaking about the British Library's recent IFHORS project. And I think that's all I have to say. I'll type in the contact details into the chat for anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Thanks. And so now really we're just handing back to you, George, but thank you very much for cooperating with us, and let's hope that's going to continue in the future. Thanks very much.
Absolutely agree. It's lovely to have you both here, and it's a pleasure to be able to co-host with you. And those sound like fascinating events. So do be sure to chase up the links that William is putting in the chat now. And if anyone is interested, William's just published a very interesting article on oral history of threadworks in Paisley in the journal Labour History. So do chase that up. But there's one plug we're all here for. So let me hand over to Dr. Jane Traies, who you'll all know from her works on the oral history of older lesbians, work there published by also by Routledge, but as well as Routledge by Tollington. So Jane, over to you. You'll just have to unmute yourself, Jane, and then we'll be good to go.
Yeah, unmute yourself, Jane. Can you hear me now? Sorry. Thank you, George. And hello, everybody. I'm just excited about this. I'm so pleased to be introducing Clare tonight as we celebrate the publication of her book, Creating Verbatim Theatre from Oral Histories. And I have to say, it's lovely to have such an enormous audience for this event, which possibly we have to thank Zoom for, don't we? Because we don't have to travel anywhere except to our screen. And what it's given us is not only a very large audience, but I think looking around, a really diverse one, which is tremendous. So in particular, I think it's really appropriate that that audience tonight contains, sorry, I got a noise in the ear, go away. Sorry, I was going to say it's particularly appropriate that this is a joint event tonight for the two special interest groups. We haven't ever done this before together, but this is the ideal occasion for it because we're bringing here now theatre makers, performers and other creatives together with more sort of straight down the middle, if you like, oral historians. And that's great because this is a book which actually crosses that divide, if it is a divide, or brings those two worlds together. And I think I should start by saying that I can't think of anyone better qualified to write such a book than Clare, because she's, of course, an experienced and respected practitioner in both those fields. So I guess looking again around the audience, there are many of us here who came across Clare first as a stage performer. as a singer-songwriter, or possibly as the writer and director of Verbatim plays, beginning quite a long time ago now with Gateway to Heaven. And later, of course, the interviews that informed Gateway to Heaven became an important book of LGBTQ oral history. And then more recently, Clare brought together her ideas about these interlinked activities by doing a postgraduate research degree, and this year was awarded a doctorate from the University of London for her thesis, which was about the role of the contributor in verbatim theatre processes. So that shows, I think, how well qualified she is to cover this very wide and interesting field. What I also have to say is that within literally months of producing that thesis and getting that doctorate, Clare has now produced this book. I can't think of anyone else who's got quite the work rate that Clare has got. I'm not quite sure whether both those things happened within the calendar year, but I rather think they did. And here it is, an accessible and down-to-earth guide to the theory and practice of verbatim theatre. So brilliant to be able to celebrate that fact today, Clare, and to welcome you to this celebration of your work. Now, I'm going to ask Clare a few questions. We're going to have a little chat, but I'm not planning to take up all the time available to us this evening. And while we're talking and while you're listening, do post up in the chat any questions that you might have, because we want to make room for a question and answer session at the end. So Clare, darling, let's start off with a really obvious question. I'm very aware that the two pieces of writing that you've done recently, your thesis and this book, are very different from each other. And I know from experience how much effort both those things take. So what was it that made you want to write this book, having already spent all that time writing your thesis? What was the beginning of this book? What was the inspiration for it? Why did you need to do this as well?
Well, I think you played part in that, Jane.
What?
I don't know if you remember, but you forwarded an email from Nancy McKay, who is an amazing woman who lives in the west coast of the States, who's the series editor of the Practicing Oral History series. Absolutely. And she, as well as being lovely, amazing, intelligent, vibrant, just put out a general email, which you saw and I didn't, saying, does anyone have any ideas of other books that she could put in her Practicing Oral History series? So
I have completely forgotten this. You're blaming me. Okay, fine.
Yes. So you asked me where it came about, and it was you, because had I not seen that email, I certainly wouldn't have had the knowledge and probably not the arrogance to say, "Oh yes, yes, yes. Let's do." You know, if you're looking at different forms of looking at verbatim, looking at oral history, then verbatim theatre, to me, that was something I was studying, I was involved in, I was looking at academically, I'd worked on practically, and I thought she'd knock it back, and she just said, this is fabulous. And so it just coincided with the last 2 years of my doctorate, so it really was, it wasn't a choice to do them at the same time.
And why do we need this book as well as your doctorate? What's this book doing that you haven't done before?
They're linked, but it's certainly not a monograph in any way. Sorry, I have to go back a bit. You know me, I can't answer a question quickly. But so first degree was actually in history. Then I went into acting, became an actress, as you do. And then shortly after that, I became involved in community theatre, which here is now in academic circles called applied theatre, even though some people don't like that term very much. But one of the community theatres I worked with was Age Exchange, which was run by Pam Schweitzer, who is now introducing the SIG Creatives. It all goes around and comes around. And I've absolutely fell in love with verbatim theatre. She was performing and producing and writing what was called reminiscence theatre. So it was play is created from interviews with older people about their memories. And so the memory part was a very, very integral part of that work, as far as stimulating memories from seeing people performing and singing and so on. But I just became interested in, I love stories. I really do. I don't know. I mean, I know many of you here, and I know I chat a lot as well, but I'm also fascinated in everybody, and everybody's got a story as far as I'm concerned. So I do like listening to people's stories and what they're up to. And so that side of things really interested me. I had the listening, I could carry on acting. Then I got into the writing, which Pam helped me with. And then after many years there, I said, well, I want to set up my own theatre company. And that's how Gateway to Heaven came about, which was based on interviews with 24 older lesbians and gay men, you see, because by this time I had to bring the LGBT stuff in it, obviously, because I'm me. And so produced that play. That was back in 2006. So you can imagine the older contributors were providing stories from the late 1940s to the mid 1980s was when the story stopped. So there was this extra dimension that was going on now, that I saw the historical importance of verbatim theatre. It isn't history, but in the same way you could say, well, oral history isn't history, we're a relative of history. Well, perhaps verbatim theatre, especially if it's historical in nature, is filling in historical and social and political gaps that we haven't otherwise heard about or have been underdocumented. So I carried on with the theatre work. In a few years ago, I wrote and performed Rites of Passage, which was based on stories with LGBT asylum seekers. And then as my theatre work based on interviews grew, so did I got approached by various LGBT groups, including Stonewall and London Metropolitan Archives, who wanted me to do oral history projects, finding out about LGBT lives. And so the two areas started, I just loved interviewing everybody. As I said, it was wonderful. And if they were gay, then even better, for me, but very exciting, very interesting. Then I started my master's at Royal Holloway on the role of a contributor to verbatim theatre, because that had always just excited me so much, is what is the contributor getting out of it? When I say the contributor, I mean the narrator, the interviewer, interviewee. They've got different terms, but for theatre, I call it a contributor. What happens when they see their stories acted on stage? What's their reflexive experience of that encounter? Should they be involved beyond the interview stage? What's the benefit if they were? How can that work theatrically? By this time, because of my oral history work, I was reading oral history sort of on the side almost to my theatre degree. And then I just had this ping moment where it literally was like, these two disciplines are so related. They join at the point of finding interviewees, the interview process, the transcription process, and then they diverge at the point of what the output is. And then obviously, if you study oral history academically, you follow certain tenets about how you should work, because it's a historical discipline, and what you should do with the metadata, and how it must be used and archived and stored as part of the historical record. And then you started looking at, well, what happens to theatre? Theatre interviews generally aren't seen by anybody. The whole interview isn't seen after the interview takes place, except by the playwright. The playwright has enormous editing power, which most oral historians would, quietly pass out if you said, you know, we'd like to take chunks and bits and edits and throw them all together and make a mix match. And so I started looking at the similarities and the differences. But then I suppose what the prompt to write about those connections that I'd seen, which obviously other people have seen as well, but it as you say, I've just got a lot of experience now in both those fields. And I thought, well, what can one teach the other?
This I think is one of the really interesting central thoughts in this book. Where you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between oral history and verbatim theatre, but you're also talking about what the two disciplines can offer to each other. Yeah? Let's talk a bit more about that.
Yes. Now, not wanting to in any way, I have to be careful here, because one of my main sort of concerns is the lack of ethical scrutiny verbatim playwrights not employ, but they have nothing to turn to as far as the ethics of what they're doing. They go, generally, in my experience, they work by their own moral compass, which is often very high. I'm not putting them down, I'm not putting myself down, but we don't have guidebooks, we don't have oral history websites. The oral history English website has loads of how-to advice, loads of ethical advice, very, very strict. It's the same with the Oral History Association, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere that works with oral history has spent decades teasing out these ethical issues. And I find that in verbatim theatre, many of those same ethical issues arise. We're employing other people's testimonies. We are using them often for our own purposes or use. We are sort of hoping that maybe they get some fun and enjoyment out of it, but it is essentially an appropriative and even an exploitative act. Now we say, well, we're creatives, we're darling, lovey, you know, we can't have guidelines because, sweetheart, you know, this would affect what I'm trying to do theatrically, and I don't want guidelines. So obviously, you know, I'm taking that a bit to extremes, but that's where the crunch lies, is that should we have guidelines? Should there? Now, the two disciplines of oral history and verbatim, another reason they are so similar is that they grew and appeared at the same point historically in the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
This is something I very much like to hear you say more about, because you mentioned it in passing in your introduction, the idea of making otherwise unheard historical voices heard. Right. And now you're telling us that these two disciplines come from the same moment in time and for very much that similar purpose.
That's again what I've noticed, is that in England it was slightly different in America, because America up to that period had what was known as a top-down view towards oral history. So people like Alan Nevins and Columbia and other interviewers who had just began to do oral histories were interviewing the rich and powerful in America. Around that time in England, however, people like E.P. Thompson and even Paul Thompson from the Oral History Society were saying, wait a minute, the voices we haven't got in history are the working classes. We don't have the working class. So any historian knows that and will tell you that. And it was the oral historians who said, well, we can find them. We can find those voices that don't appear in the history books. And off they went with their, obviously it coincided with the development of the portable tape recorder. So off they went to find them. Now, concurrently, at the same time, theatre makers were also coming across that realization, saying, do you know what? Theatre doesn't offer us images or plays or knowledge about the working classes. And they extended that and they said, or in fact, any marginalized communities, there's hardly any representation. And so they began to seek out representations that had been previously underdocumented. And one of those, one of the highest then at that point was also the working class voice. And then comes into the scene Peter Cheeseman at Stoke. And I think we've got an actress here who, if not two, who worked with him at that time, watching tonight. And he was saying, we've got local people in our community, let's ask their stories, bring them into the theatre, dramatize them. And then other people came in and said, wait a minute, yeah, what about the voices of older working class people in Southeast London? You know, Pam Schweitzer comes in, and there's a company called Eastern Angles that said, we don't know anything about the stories of local rural communities in Suffolk. Let's write plays about that. So, and now it's as the decades have gone on, you can see that the interest has got wider and wider and wider. Now we're interested in Serbian refugees and, you know, a mining event that happened in Australia. And, you know, but these, to me, these are all historically undocumented areas. Now, verbatim theatre doesn't have to focus on an historically undocumented area, but a lot of them do. And a lot of verbatim theatre also, if it doesn't focus on historically undocumented work, it looks at political issues that aren't being covered or that are maybe being misrepresented in the media, or a social matter that a playwright feels needs more coverage. And so to me, we're all trying to do the same work. We're trying to find hidden stories, lost stories, silent stories. And this is where, for me, LGBT stuff comes in so importantly, because our communities have been silenced. We have been historically criminalized and shamed and silenced and underdocumented. So oral history and indeed verbatim theatre are an ideal place to start with LGBTQ history, and many, many other marginalised communities.
Claire, I'm just thinking as you speak, I'm very interested because I'm thinking about the similarities there between oral history work and the making of theatre that you've described. But I'm also thinking about writing things back into the record. You're talking about putting things back into history. And I'm thinking about lastingness. With oral history, for instance, we're constantly urged, I mean, right from the beginning by Rafe Samuel and then onward from there, to keep what we've got, not just to talk about the bits we choose to talk about out of the interviews, but to keep those original interviews, transcripts and recordings, put them in an archive, put them back into the historical record so they can still be found. And I'm also thinking about one of the joys of theatre and performance being its essentially ephemeral nature. The fact that when you've been to the theatre, you might have been immensely caused to think and moved and so on by these otherwise unheard voices, but you can never go to that performance again 20 years down the line. Not all, you know, theatre doesn't exist to be recorded. Does that matter?
Oh, I mean, that's absolutely, I think, where the two disciplines can meet and complement each other as well. Oral history seeks to preserve the interview fairly intact for the historical record and put it in an archive. And many oral historians that I know and that I've read are slightly frustrated that material does end up in an archive, and they're always looking for ways, imaginative ways, where more people can see all these wonderful oral histories that they have gathered. So they know that their discipline, the purpose, because it complements history, their purpose is to document those voices and to analyze them, write articles about them, interrogate, them rigorously. But so many people I know have done wonderful oral history projects which run out, ping, as soon as that funding stops. And when the funding stops, the people stop. We can't all work for nothing. And so whatever, oral history has to generally all work with an archive. The oral histories go into the archive, and who knows? We don't know whether they're there. Hardly anyone knows. So archivists and historians and oral historians are constantly looking for ways to disperse the knowledge that they've found. And it just seems obvious to me that creating verbatim theatre from those oral histories would be one way of making that happen. Now, obviously, theatre audiences, generally, unless you get into the national and Alec Blythe's work and David Hare's work, which is not really the work I'm talking about, because I'm talking about more marginalised communities, we're going to have smaller audiences, but at least, we get it around the country, we put plays on, we raise awareness, we tell people about things they didn't know about. And at the moment, because of the increasing popularity of oral history, I think there's an increasing amount of people who've either said, I've got this bundle of oral histories that is brilliant, but I don't know what to do with it, or there's a really interesting subject that I want to conduct oral histories about, but I've no idea how to go about it. And it actually would make a fantastic theatre project. That's where the book comes in. I hope that it's for oral historians who want to disperse, who are looking for ways of dispersing the wonderful testimonies they've uncovered, and also for theatre practitioners who are particularly concerned about some of the ethical questions that I rose earlier. Who's speaking for who? What right have we to drop people's parts of people's testimonies and not include them, and not mention that we haven't included them? A lot of it's to do with feminist thought that, that interested me, that played into that self-reflexivity, valuing the contributor, feeding back, reciprocity. I mean, these are all feminist concepts, but I'm interested in how we can make them work in verbatim theatre, so that we might always be accused of appropriation, but we as a discipline in theatre have not addressed this in the way that other areas of research have. Oral historians have discussed appropriation and exploitation of interviews. Anthropologists have, sociologists have, ethnographers have, verbatim theatre practitioners haven't. So I just think there's a give and take about the two disciplines.
We've actually had a question in the chat while we've been talking about the rights, if you like, of the interviewee. And so it's interesting that you've brought that up and spoken to it. It may be that it will come up again later in the conversation. It might even be that that's a good moment to move to other people's questions, if there are any. Just give you a minute or two to think about questions and to post them, or to post a message to George that you've got a question. While you're doing that, I'll just tell a little story which speaks, I think, to something that Claire was saying about whether you retain something in an archive. I've been involved in an oral history project over the last couple of years, which has been taking place along the south coast of England. In fact, I see the artistic director, yes, on my screen. And Dinos, you may want to say something later about this, but it was collecting stories from older LGBT people. And right from the beginning, the determination was that it would become a piece of theatre. It was going to be part of the Brighton Festival. and it was going to have all sorts of other little bits of theatre and performance springing off from it that could be taken around to places. And then, of course, COVID hit. What's happened in between has been fascinating because it's been very creative. The whole thing has been moved online and has now turned into a series of online performances. But that, of course, means that it now has a permanent record and will always be there if people want to look at it. So it's kind of come round full circle of what we were talking about. Right, that must have given people time, I think, to think about questions. George, do we have any?
We do. I think what I'll do, I should have said this at the start, is I will stop recording so people can feel free to ask questions and have a discussion as openly as they want. So unless either of you want to say anything final for the recording, you know, the inner oral historian, us all, you know, anything else to say on the tape?
Well, I would like to ask Claire a final question. I was going to keep it to the end, but if we're going to finish recording, Claire, given that you've got this tremendous work rate and this enormous breadth of experience and activity, what are you going to do now?
I've got quite a few plans up my sleeve. I've been in academia for so long that part of me really wants to carry on doing some things there, and the other part of me just thinks, please let me do some stand-up, and the other part of me thinks I need to record an album. So I'm afraid I've got too many choices at the moment, but they'll all be about LGBT stuff, theatre, or asking people about their stories. And all of those three things are connected, and all of those things represent every piece of work I think I do. But if I'm just allowed to say one last thing as well, George, before we stop, the shape of this particular book is, I talk a lot about verbatim theatre for people who don't know what it is. I talk about oral history for theatre people who don't know what oral history is. Hopefully, you know, condescending to nobody. There's quite a strong chunk in the middle about what I think is to do with ethical challenges and in verbatim theatre, and how we can look to our partners in oral history, what we can take from that ethically, what we can leave because it's not relevant, because they're not actually the same the same disciplines. So that's a very strong part of my work. And then the rest of the book is, well, a how-to sounds a bit like a recipe book. It's not quite sort of as clear cut as that, but it's really so that anyone can pick it up, whether they're from the theatre world or the oral history world or some other world, and say, what are the possibilities? And that's really what I've tried to offer is many, and there's a few people in the audience who have helped me with that, who I've recognized, gone, oh no, she told me about her project, and I think Helena Enright's there, and people who've plays I've seen or heard about, and I've tried to put as many of those in the book as possible, just little bits about them, so that the reader can go ping, 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 ping. Yes, I'd like to do that, but I can't do that. But we've only got these people. Well, we are professional actors, or we're only students, or we're not. We're oral historians, but we haven't got actors, you know, or we haven't got interviews. I've tried to pitch it at every different level for anyone who's interested in not just the subject matter, but in how to create something themselves.
All yours, George, I think.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. I'm going to stop the recording.